Berserk premiered in August of 1989, the same year as classics like Hajime no Ippo, and would share the spotlight with JoJo's and Dragon Ball. Berserk would also go on to inspire other franchises like Dark Souls. This is my first read of Berserk, but there is one part of the story I am familiar with. Guts and Griffith used to be close friends until Griffith decided to ascend and Guts didn't take too kindly to that, losing an arm in the process and all of his friends. Hence why this video is called 80% Blind. Because of this limited knowledge of the story, I just saw it as a typical dark fantasy revenge tale, but when I began reading it, I understood why it had such a huge following and began to see it more than just a manga, but also a piece of literature. To read the series, I used the 3-in-1 Dark Horse volume sets, which the first one ends at around the beginning of the Golden Age arc, so this video will only cover the Black Swordsman arc. This is not really a critical review of Berserk, but more of a personal interpretation of its characters, themes, and settings. When I first saw the parental advisory in the cover of my volume, I assumed it was because of violence and typical dark fantasy setting gore. However, this first page really sets a tone for the rest of the story. Knowing that Miura kind of wrote Berserk as he went along, at least some of the early scenes, explains the contradiction of this first scene. Later on in the story, we see that Guts does not like to be touched in any way by anybody, yet here in this first scene, he's being intimate with the very beings he's waged war against. Because of this, I see this first scene as more of a warning given to the reader, kind of saying that if you can't handle this, stop bringing out because it's only going to get worse. And it really does get worse. The story really begins in this first scene with Guts in the carriage, in which he makes eye contact with one of the children. This first scene goes a long way in establishing the duality of Guts as a person and beginning to show that lie that he tells himself. We see that Guts tells himself that he doesn't care about anybody else, just his own personal war. Yet in this scene, he looks back at the carriage. We find out later that Guts knew about the fate of these children and he knew that they were going to be sacrificed. Yet he still looks back because he's at conflict with himself in this scene. A part of Guts wants to save the children. This part of Guts can save the children. We see later on that he's very capable in combat, and there's nothing really stopping him from saving these children, except for the other part of Guts that wants to keep the lie that his own personal goal and his own personal war is more important than the lives of anybody else. Nothing else matters, just his goal, as he says later on in the prison. This is the beginning of the lie that Guts tells himself, and it's a lie that gets torn down by the end of the story, which I'll bring up once we reach that point. We get another glimpse of Guts showing sympathy for other people in the fact that Guts did intentionally save Puck. If you notice, the first thug that he targets is the thug that's tormenting Puck. Even though he denies it later on, I feel like it's Guts' way of continuing to lie to himself. We get our first real instance of combat in Berserk, and this establishes something that I think is important. We see for the first time Guts is drawn with a shadowed face and one glowing eye. I'll go into what I think it means when it happens more often later in the story, but this is the first time we see it. We are then introduced to Puck, who serves as a comedic relief and a way for Guts to get more exposition out to the audience in a more natural way. We are then given another instance of Guts actively pushing people away, but not even letting Puck sit on his shoulder. In the next scene when Guts is captured, we see that he's once again drawn with only one visible eye. Keep this in mind because I'm going to explain what I think this means once we get to the Snake Baron fight. We are then introduced to the villain of this part of the story, the Snake Apostle, through mostly distant shots and some subtle close-ups, which gives the overall impression of this is a humanoid creature, yet aspects of him such as his teeth are distinctly inhuman. Now stick with me here, because this is kind of a strange comparison to make, but in Men in Black it's established that celebrities and people in power turn out to be aliens despite looking like humans. And this is kind of a similar aspect with the Snake Apostle, because he is a person in power who looks like a human, and if you were somebody in the town and you saw him from a distance like you probably would, you would assume he's a human. Yet, upon closer inspection, you find out that he's this horrific demon creature, because not many humans eat ears and have very bad dental work, unless you're British. This is an important point that I'm going to get to once we reach the Snake Apostle fight, but this is the beginning of establishing a connection between demons and humans, because in reality, the demons we construct in our narratives are just exaggerations of aspects and emotions of humanity. Think 7 Deadly Sins, for example. There's something that all humans can relate to or have certain aspects of, but exaggerated in such a way that they become a different creature entirely. The snake apostle being very humanoid and looking like a human is perhaps Muro's way of suggesting that maybe these exaggerations are less exaggerated than we think. Perhaps us humans and these demons we create in our narratives are more similar than we would like to believe. This could also be interpreted as demons or bad people being in plain sight and hidden all around you, and you not realizing it until you get close enough to understand the person. We then get this nightmare sequence of Guts in the prison, where he sees this weird fetus creature, which I assume holds some importance later on in the story because this isn't the last time we see this fetus creature. After this, Puck shows up to heal Guts, but even still, Guts refuses to be touched, showing that Guts is not a loner by accident. He actively pushes people away. We find out that this could be because Guts considers himself as bad luck, which to an extent he is, as demons and evil spirits are pursuing him. But the fact that he actively pushes people away shows that he cares enough about the innocent that he doesn't want them to get into harm's way because of his influence. This panel also provides a nice contrast between Guts and Puck as characters. We see the more lighthearted Puck with a nice smile on his face, and we see the more serious and emotional Guts with heavy emotion of anger in his face. We're then introduced to the brand on Guts' neck, and again, this is another instance of Guts being drawn without his eye, which I'm gonna get to towards the end. Guts then utters the biggest lie he will continue to tell himself, that he doesn't care about anybody else or any other people in the town, just that the snake burns a target to him and he wants to end him. This lie causes Puck to feel a lot of pain and a lot of pressure given off by Guts' emotion. Specifically, it's rage, fear, and sadness. Given what I know about what happens to Guts or what had happened to Guts, I interpret this as sadness about his past and what he used to have, fear of it happening again to the people closest to him, and rage at his inability to stop it from happening in the first place. Puck then kind of calls Guts out on this because he asks why did he save him then if he doesn't really care about anybody else. To which Guts tells his second lie that he didn't save Puck and that Puck didn't really matter to him, it was just a formality. Guts belittling this moment in Puck's life gives us this huge panel of a Puck tearing up, meaning that this really hurt Puck in a way that Guts doesn't really understand. And this causes Puck to leave Guts. Guts has a knee-jerk reaction to this because whether he wants to admit it or not, he enjoyed Puck's company. He was having a conversation with another person, tiny person, for the first time in perhaps a very, very long time. And even though at this point of the story, Guts doesn't really need Puck as he has the keys and he can escape, he still kind of feels a little bit of guilt for making Puck leave. And he wonders, why did Puck even help me in the first place? This is the first instance of Puck unlocking a hidden sympathy that Guts has, which we'll see again later in the story, but this is the first instance in which it happens. We then see that the brand bleeds whenever demons are nearby, and Guts, not wanting to go into the battle disadvantaged by blood loss, licks the blood from his fingers. We're then shown the commencement of Snake Baron's attack on the castle town, with some very, very horrific imagery, showing that warning in the beginning was very well warranted. The interesting thing about this panel is that the Snake Baron is drawn with glowing eyes, and what we see again is that Guts is also drawn with the one glowing eye, like before. We also see Guts drawn with the one eye again later on when he's in combat, and also before when he was talking about these demons. The fact that being drawn with the one glowing eye makes Guts look less human and more akin to the glowing eyes of the Snake Apostle leads me to believe that this theme of the one glowing eye and it only really showing up during times of combat or times when Guts is inflicting great violence is a way of connecting Guts to the demons he's fighting. As we see during this battle, it starts off as the Snake Apostle torturing and taking pleasure in the death and harm that he deals to others. Yet we see once Guts has the upper hand, he's behaving in a very similar way to the Snake Apostle. He's taking pleasure and enjoyment in the pain of, instead of people, demons, which is better than taking pleasure in the pain of people and especially children. Yet really, when you take a step back, Guts is doing the same thing that the Snake Apostle was doing, just to a different person. So the one glowing eye and Guts acting in a similar way is Miura's way of connecting the demonic nature of Guts to the very people he's fighting. After Guts seemingly wins by shooting down the Snake Baron with a completely straight-faced look, it's revealed that he transformed into his more demonic, horrific-looking form into his giant snake monster, and we get the first instance of Guts being really the ultimate underdog. It's important to note that, as far as I know, and at this point in the story, Guts is a human, and despite his guts literally spilling almost all over the place with blood gushing out of his head, he still continues to fight and eventually gets the upper hand and wins. This is very similar to old Japanese samurai ways of thinking, especially if you read something around the Musashi era. The concept of even if your sword breaks, you still have your fists, and if your fists break, you still have your mouth, and if your mouth breaks, well, you still have your legs. That theme of fighting and fighting until you can't anymore defines Guts as a person and really can motivate readers to keep pushing even though the odds look very bleak. Guts survives long enough to get close to use his cannon arm and blast half the Snake Baron's face off. We're then taken to the part where I mentioned that Guts is beginning to take pleasure in torturing the Snake Baron. He's drawn with his very demonic looking grin, he's stepping over the Snake Baron, and instead of mercy killing him, because realistically at this point, the Snake Baron is not a threat anymore. He could do something like Vegeta did against the Ginyu Force, where once they were down, he just killed them and then that's it. Vegeta didn't torture them because, while in that part of the story, Vegeta wasn't necessarily a hero, he still wasn't a maniacal villain that takes pleasure in torture. Unlike Guts, who is supposed to be our hero, if you're very new and reading the story for the first time, you would assume that he's a hero, yet you're taken aback by this because why is the hero torturing and taking pleasure in torture? While there is a wicked sense of justice to this act of torture, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that sort of thing, a hero or a protagonist who defines himself as a hero seeks only to dish out justice in the sense of neutralizing a threat. Taking pleasure in torture or committing torture is not very heroic. This really establishes Guts' own personal demons and his own demonic nature, as in this instance he's drawn with a glowing eye and drawn in a very demonic looking way. You could also argue that Guts is only doing this as interrogation tactics, as he's trying to get information about the God Hand. But even if that were the case, Guts still leaves the Snake Apostle to burn to death, the longest and most painful way to kill someone. So Guts does still take a sadistic pleasure in the pain of this entity. Puck is then overrun by Guts' emotions, and as Guts leaves the battlefield and Puck looks back on the battlefield filled with the dead bodies of innocents and other people alike, it led me to realize that this battlefield is littered with all these corpses because of Guts and Guts alone. If Guts never showed up, these people wouldn't have died, and Guts said so himself, and the fact that Guts just leaves in the wake of all these corpses really establishes the fact that Guts truly believes a lie, that he cares about nothing else, just his personal war. Later we see that Puck and Guts meet up again, and Puck continues to follow Guts because of the possibility of seeing cool things. Guts is then picked up by this priest and his daughter, and despite warning them that he's being pursued by evil spirits, they still actively try to help Guts. Before Guts enters the carriage, he tells himself to lie one more time. We also get a glimpse of the way Guts sees the world. A death doing what you love and doing what you enjoy doing is better than a life with no passion. The second nightmare sequence of this arc goes a long way into showing Guts' state of mind during this time. We see an eye from above constantly looking down at him, which we find out later turns out to be the incubus that attacks him, but in this instance in this dream, it could also be the fact that demons are always pursuing him and always watching him. The fact that Guts is in such a tight space covered by these two walls in a linear path shows his limited amount of options that he has. He can't really turn left or right. He can only go forward, which would be continuing his war against these demons, or taking a step back, which would be his own death. Another interesting thing to note about this dream is that Guts is naked during the sequence, and this is something that occurs in real life. Psychologist Ian Wallace believes that nudity within a dream signifies fears of being exposed. It could also be interpreted as constantly being watched or unprepared, or even that you're trying too hard to keep alive to yourself. All these interpretations could be applied to Guts' state of mind during this time. When Guts encounters a fetus creature again during this dream sequence, he loses his prosthetic arm. We see before that Guts' main tools of dealing damage are his sword and his prosthetic arm. Given that he is naked, he doesn't have access to his sword. The prosthetic arm was the last bit of defense he had, and losing that and being confronted with this fetus creature, which for right now I believe represents perhaps Guts' inner fears or something along those lines. But being exposed to that with no form of self-defense leads Guts to have this true, genuine look of shock and fear. Before the army of skeletons attack, Guts warns the girl, who we find out is named Colette, to stay in the carriage, which is another instance of him caring for other people. If Guts really believed the lie that he tells himself, why would he tell the girl to stay in the carriage? If he really didn't care about other people, then he would just let them die and not try to stop it. Unfortunately, Guts is not able to save Colette. before the battle ensues, we also get panels of Guts having different expressions. Confidence and a little bit of fear, showing that Guts does this all the time. This isn't his first rodeo, but the possibility of Guts' war ending here with his own death is still very real. We also see that Colette has been possessed and decapitated her own father, and the sight of this, Guts goes into a sort of shock. The fact that this was another life that Guts couldn't save, another life that was prematurely ended because of his involvement, sends Guts into a sort of shock. He remembers the little girl that she used to be compared to the monster that she turned into, sends Guts to the shock. It's only when he's being stabbed and does his reflex kick in and he chops the girl in half. Guts snaps back to reality once Colette's blood lands on his face. At the realization of what Guts has done, he begins to throw up, realizing that he has killed a child, one of the most frowned upon and heinous acts any person can commit. Guts jumps back into the fight filled with hatred and malice, perhaps towards these demons, perhaps towards himself, and we get this 2-panel spread reminiscent of the Doom cover art, which is one man against all these demons, and it's also another instance of Guts being drawn with the one glowing eye. Perhaps his own failure at saving Colette causes his more demonic nature to spring to the surface, and this is why we see the glowing eye yet again. We are then taken to the aftermath of the battle, where we see a glimpse of Colette's body, but not its entirety. In this way, Miura is getting us, the readers, to have our imagination do the work for him by picturing how horrifically mutilated the body is. It's more impactful this way, and many horror films do the same thing. As Guts solemnly looks back on Colette's body, Puck tries to tell him that it wasn't his fault. After Puck says this, Guts snaps back to reality and tells himself to lie again, that Colette was just a casualty of his war. In the end, it didn't really matter. Guts also says that if you're always worried about the ants beneath you, you won't be able to walk, which is a very skewed and selfish way to view the world. Perhaps this is what he told himself when he looked back at the kids in the carriage, that he can't worry about these ants, I have to keep taking the next step forward. Another interesting thing about this is that I always see Guts described as a stoic character. However, this kind of mindset goes against the fundamentals of Stoicism. The fundamentals of Stoicism are best explained in this Educated Barbarian series by the channel Natural Hypertrophy, and specifically in part 5, which I'll play a clip for you now.
Everything you do needs to be after reason, and reason is after what is best for mankind. And that, in a sense, is extremely smart, because you can circumvent Stoicism very easily and turn it into hedonism. If you say, for example, well, I'm not going to share my wealth, I'm just going to use it for myself, because that's what reason dictates. Yeah, that's the reason of pleasure seeking, but it's not the reason that one would follow if their goal is to benefit mankind as a whole.
The demons continue to taunt Guts from beyond the grave, and they reach Guts in a very vulnerable moment where he's telling a lie to himself. Guts shuts them up by shooting his prosthetic arm. After this, we get this one small panel of a look on Guts' face, and just from this small panel of his eye alone, Miura is really able to convey a lot of emotion, and this speaks to his talent as an artist. This look on Guts' face is the kind you get when you realize that you were wrong or you wronged somebody. At this moment, Guts is realizing that he is guilty for the deaths of the priest and his daughter. Just like the townspeople before them, it's Guts' involvement that led to the deaths of these innocent people. Because he didn't really get to know the townspeople from before, but he did get to know the priest and the little girl a little bit, this one hits a lot closer to home, and it's Guts realizing that I am responsible for the deaths of these innocent people. They do matter. As Guts continues to walk down this path, Puck tells the audience that this is the world that he lives in. This is a pain that Guts will always feel every day of his life. And we get this last bit of fan service before the chapter ends.